Well, welcome everyone. I am Mariah Ilsley, Director of Public Program Administration at Historic New England. Historic New England, founded as the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities in 1910, is the oldest, largest, and most comprehensive independent preservation organization in the United States. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Marquis de Lafayette Returns to Boston. We'll begin the presentation momentarily, but before we do, we have just a couple notes. First, this program is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to everyone who registered within a few days. Second, there are live captions being generated, and you can access these by clicking on the captioning or live transcript button on your Zoom window. And finally, time permitting, we will be taking questions after the presentation. To ask a question at any point this evening, please use the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now I'll turn it over to Carla Rosenstein, Site Manager for Historic New England's Quincy House and Eustis Estate. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Hello, welcome everyone to this program. We're excited to welcome author, public historian Elizabeth Reese. We were looking at how we might celebrate the anniversary of Lafayette's return trip to the United States for the Quincy House and decided we wanted to kind of have a little bit of a book club, book chat with Elizabeth because she just came out with an amazing new book on this tour, the Marquis de Lafayette Returns. And Elizabeth is head of interpretation at Woodlawn and Pope Leahy House in Alexandria, Virginia. She's worked at the U.S. Capitol and many other museums. And she is going to give us a little bit of context about the tour. And then we're going to have a kind of group discussion with several of us from the local Boston perspective. So I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carla, for that lovely introduction. Let me get my screen set up here so we can all see the slides. So as Carla mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Reese. I'm a public historian in the Washington, D.C. area, and I am just thrilled to have the opportunity to speak to you all virtually tonight and give a little bit more context behind Lafayette's 1824-1825 tour. So I find that Lafayette is a little bit different than a lot of other historical figures that we're used to, a lot of his peers like Washington and Jefferson, where we know a lot about their lives. Lafayette's a little bit of an anomaly, and that's largely because that he was not born here in the United States. He was born into the French noble class when he was one of the wealthiest young men in France by the time he even reached his teenage years, as both of his parents had died when he was very young. He was inspired by the American Revolution and the values of the American Revolution as a teenager. He grows up during the age of the Enlightenment, and so these concepts of self-government and human rights are very attractive to him. And when he finds out what's going on in the United States, he sails across the Atlantic and he volunteers his services to the Continental Army. He is 19 years old when he does this, so he's a very, very young man at his time of arriving here in the United States. He becomes very close with George Washington very quickly. Washington may have been a little bit unimpressed with this inexperienced Frenchman, but Lafayette quickly proves his bravery on the battlefield, and he also had this humility that a lot of his peers did not have, because where many of these other French nobles were coming to volunteer for the Revolution, they were looking for title or a payment, and Lafayette told Washington he was here to learn and not teach. He serves throughout the Revolution. At the end of the war, after the siege of Yorktown, he returns to France in 1781. And then he comes back to America in 1784 for a pretty brief visit, but he does not return again until 1824. So the Revolution tends to be a really large part of how we remember Lafayette. And so when we picture him, we may picture him like we see him in this portrait here, this young, dashing military hero in his uniform. But the Lafayette that Americans saw in 1824 looked a lot different than this. Here is the Lafayette that Americans saw upon his arrival to America in 1824. He looks a lot different. He is a lot older. He is walking with a cane to assist him. So what happened in Lafayette's life in these 40 years that span the American Revolution to his return? He sees the French Revolution. He is quite active in the French Revolution, and he's quite unpopular in France during the French Revolution. He believed in a constitutional monarchy, which is kind of ironic for France. He just fought a war against a monarchy for America, but for France, he felt like a constitutional monarchy where there was still a king, but people still had representation and a voice to balance things out was the best way forward for France. And this was a very unpopular position to have, especially as the revolution is escalating and the terror is really starting to happen. And during this time, French nobles are especially targeted, and Lafayette really realized that the guillotine was likely going to be his fate. So he flees from France with the hopes of coming here to America, but he's captured en route, and he's actually imprisoned for 5 years. When he gets out of prison, America enters the quasi-war with France. This is kind of more of a Cold War between these two nations as opposed to actual fighting, but it wasn't safe for Lafayette to return. So despite his wanting to return in this 40-year interim, he never had the opportunity to. I also like to show these images side by side so you can really see the difference and the toll that his life kind of took on him. And interestingly enough, and I don't think this was the intention of the artist of the 1820s portrait, but they're mirror poses. They're quite similar poses, so you can really notice those differences. So what brought Lafayette back to America in 1824? In the 1820s, America was on the cusp of her 50th birthday. We are on the cusp of celebrating the semi-quincentennial, the 250th. Well, 200 years ago, America was on the cusp of celebrating her 50th birthday. And the nation was really not in kind of this patriotic celebratory mood. We were under the presidency of James Monroe, and what James Monroe saw in his presidency that one of the outcomes of the War of 1812 was that Americans start seeing themselves as Americans, kind of this collective term to describe the whole country. Prior to this, you would have seen yourself as a Virginian, as a New Yorker, as where you were from, as opposed to this collective America. So Monroe wants to continue the sense of national unity that comes out of the War of 1812, and he really views political parties as the source of why everyone's not really getting along. So he's trying to avoid political parties. What happens if there's an issue, if there's a kind of a festering wound that you ignore, it's going to get much, much worse. And so Monroe kind of gets the nickname of his presidency of the era of good feelings. Sometimes you'll hear that as the era of bad feelings, as he's trying to avoid this conflict. This conflict is continuing to happen. He looks across the Atlantic for kind of someone who is going to like spark this patriotic fervor in the nation to help celebrate this 50th birthday, and Lafayette is the answer. Lafayette at this time is the last surviving major general of the American Revolution because he was so young when he first came here, only 19 years old at the time. So he's the only one still alive. And he also has this kind of collective sense of how the nation views him. They don't view him as kind of belonging to a certain political party. He's a very much a bipartisan figure and is universally adored. So he's hoping that by inviting Lafayette back for the first time in 40 years, that he will inspire patriotic fervor, bring back kind of like the spirit of 76, and invoke the memory of George Washington, because Lafayette and Washington had such a close relationship. Lafayette quickly agrees. He is not very popular in France at this time. The French Revolution completely depleted his own finances, so he's really looking for a change of pace and eagerly accepts. And so this plan is set into motion for Lafayette to come to America, and he returns on August 15th, 1824. This trip was originally only meant to be 4 months, and it extended to 13 months. Lafayette visited all 24 states. He traveled over 6,000 miles, and he was greeted by millions and millions of Americans. So the scene that you're seeing right now is, this was done in 1844, so this is not a contemporary account. It's maybe a more romanticized view of Lafayette's arrival at Castle Clinton at the edge, very tip of Manhattan in August of 1824. And at Castle Clinton, 50,000 people lined the streets to welcome Lafayette to the city. And the population of New York in this time period was 150,000. So a third of the entire city is at the southern tip of Manhattan waiting to greet him. This would have been impressive if this was just because it was Lafayette's first day in the country, but this would be replayed every single day for the next 13 months. Large cities, small cities, towns that Lafayette is just passing through would replicate this pageantry of appreciation that's kicked off in New York, because wherever Lafayette was, the crowds were going to follow. Lafayette's tour was one of the first documented cases of tourism in America on such a massive scale, with a single event, or in this case, a single person, driving groups of people to travel outside of their homes. And we really see this in smaller cities that Lafayette visits, where the number of people in the crowd that were there to greet him would frequently outnumber the recorded population at the time. So this is indicating that people are traveling temporarily to see Lafayette, which prior to this time had not really been seen before. It's also important to know that travel is really limited in this time period. If you want to go somewhere, you're going to go by foot, by horseback, by carriage, or public coach. There is a new invention in the 1820s, and it's called the steamboat. So if you have to travel by water, you could use that, but really limited when it comes to travel. And this is a time period where most people do not leave the county in which they're born in. So for people to be traveling to see Lafayette, that says a lot about what he meant to people. Lafayette also spent the winter of 1824, 1825 in Washington, D.C. He kind of uses Washington as his home base. And during that time, taverns and boarding houses in Washington reached maximum capacity at an otherwise really dead and quiet time in the city. So people knew that Lafayette was in one place, and then they would travel for the hopes of seeing him. Like, there's no guarantee, but you might see him at a ball or at the theater or at the Capitol building. And so people would travel with the hopes of seeing him. The New York Mirror and Ladies Literary Gazette kind of wrote about this Lafayette pandemonium really early on in the tour. It's just at the end of August in 1824, saying that gentlemen are ready to throw by their business to shake him by the hand, and ladies forget their lovers to dream of him. If a man asks, "Have you seen him?" you know who he means. So Lafayette had a pretty big impact right at the start, all the way through the end of the tour. Now, he was remembered on the tour through souvenirs, not unlike that we see kind of pop artists and sports stars today using merchandise. Lafayette was doing that 200 years ago as before. When towns knew that Lafayette was coming in, they would advertise in the newspaper that they had Lafayette badges. You could get ribbons with his face on it. You could buy pottery. You could buy gloves with his face on it, which kind of helped further stoke these feelings of excitement that people had. What is interesting is that there are thousands and thousands of these souvenirs that still sit in collections today. I think we're going to hear more about them later on, which really indicates that all of these things were treasured and kept and preserved, which shows like how important not only Lafayette was to the people who saw him, but that memory of seeing him, how they passed it down through their next generations as well. So Lafayette also had a really deep connection with the American people that lasted long after the tour ended. And his message of unity and the way that he brought this kind of divided nation together inspired Americans that were really bitterly torn apart by partisan politics. And I mentioned it earlier, but Monroe's invitation for Lafayette, seeing Lafayette as kind of this universal figure as opposed to a political figure, that really had a lot to do with how Lafayette was seen by the American people. Because unlike you had, I always say, like, for someone to be as equally good friends with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, I think Lafayette is the only person in American history who could say that. And he was really seen as this universal collective figure. So while he is coming to the United States during a really contested and bitter presidential election, the election of 1824, he was sometimes the only event that brought people together during this time period, because Americans saw him collectively as this like representation of the American Revolution, the values that they had fought for, regardless of any sort of political affiliation that he had. And that doesn't mean that Lafayette wasn't a political person. He was very aware of his bipartisan popularity, and what he does throughout the tour is that he uses this to his advantage. Throughout his career, Lafayette had very strong anti-slavery views, and he was not blind to the presence of slavery in the United States. But what he would do as his position as the nation's guest would kind of subvert social rules, especially in southern cities and towns, and openly welcome people who were enslaved or formerly enslaved into the fray. One of these instances is with a man named James Armistead. James Armistead served with Lafayette. He volunteered as a spy, served as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans during the siege of Yorktown, would feed the British false information and relay that intelligence back to Lafayette. At the end of the war, James petitioned for his freedom, but because his service was through espionage and not enlisted combat, he was ineligible. And Lafayette actually heard about this in 1784 when he returned to the United States and actually worked to petition to get James's freedom, which he was granted in 1787. Lafayette and James were reunited on the tour. Lafayette was on a carriage and he saw James in the crowd in Virginia and ordered his carriage to stop, called out to him, and the two men embraced publicly in the midst of a majority all-white crowd. So Lafayette was definitely saying something with this. He never takes the opportunity to kind of lecture America on perhaps her moral shortcomings, but he uses these subtle moments to try to shift things into a bit more inclusive direction in the United States. It's not an immediate change that happens in American society. I mean, we end up fighting a civil war 40 years after Lafayette's departure from the United States, but the echoes of what he stood for definitely infiltrated into American politics and American society. This is an image of suffragists protesting their right to vote outside of the White House, and they are consciously choosing the base of the Lafayette statue in Lafayette Park across from the White House. And you can kind of see up at the top, so like his name is up at the top of the statue here. Knowing that he was kind of this champion of human rights and civil liberties, and electing to protest their right to vote at the base of his statue was definitely a conscious choice that was made. One of the legacies that of him that lasted long after his tour ended. The tour also had other kind of more tangible impacts. We see it a lot in the names of towns, in schools. A lot of areas, streets were named after Lafayette after his tour here. There was also an uptick in children being named Lafayette or Fayette after the tour as well, both boys and girls, which also speaks to the legacy of youth on his tour. Children and young people had a massive, massive part of Lafayette's tour. Children, school groups were brought out, they recited poems, they sang songs, they participated in parades. And for many, many young people, Lafayette was one of the last surviving veterans of the American Revolution. And for them to see someone who had fought in the war left a very large impact on their memory of the war and how they passed that along to their children as well. I would equate it to quite similar to right now as veterans of World War II are passing away, kind of that lasting impact of our generations being the last ones to have memories of people who had fought in this war was a very similar thing that was happening in America in the 1820s. So as we enter this monumental bicentennial year, I think it becomes pretty obvious that we're missing a Lafayette-like figure these days, someone that reaches across party lines and is universally adored and welcome. So as we spend the rest of 2025 celebrating Lafayette's values, his passion, and his celebrity, I urge each and every one of us who is gathered in this space today to reflect on this final question. How can those of us who are inspired by Lafayette's words and actions be the ones to continue his work today? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we're going to introduce the members of the panel and then show you a couple more slides and then kind of go into more of a discussion. If you have more questions either for Elizabeth or the rest of us, definitely use that Q&A box and we will do the questions in a little bit. But I'm going to have my colleague Nora introduce herself and then Hillary, and I'll launch your slides, Hillary, when you're ready. So.
Great.
Thanks, Carla. And thank you, Elizabeth. That was so interesting. My name's Nora Martinez Proctor. I am a research scholar at Historic New England. I'm also the lead guide at the Josiah Quincy House in Quincy, Massachusetts, where the Mayor Josiah Quincy, who welcomed Lafayette into Boston, had his summer home.
Right. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. Yeah, thank you, Carla and Nora and Historic New England for hosting this evening, and Elizabeth for such a fascinating conversation here about Lafayette. I will say, I spent a lot of my career at a couple of national parks in Pennsylvania, in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. So very long-standing connections there. But I'm Hillary Miller. I'm the Chief of Interpretation at Adams National Historical Park here in Quincy, Massachusetts. The park tells the story of the Adams family and their dedication to public and private service. The park preserves the birthplaces of the second and sixth presidents of the U.S., John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And I'll mention both of them as we chat a little bit. And we preserve also the old house at Peacefield. And Carla, if you have, I'm happy to use slides now, or we can come back and do that later too.
Go ahead.
All right, so we are on your presentation view right now. There we go. Very good. So it's just a brief slide. For those of you who have not been to Adams National Historical Park, it is in Quincy, just not very far from the Quincy House. And I just have here a period appropriate picture from Eliza Susan Quincy. I think we'll be hearing a lot more about her later on. But it's 1824, so the time of the Lafayette tour, showing the old house at Peacefield. And there's a modern photo of that house. It is one of the houses that we preserve. And I'm highlighting this particular site because this is where Lafayette came to visit his old pal John Adams in 1824 and in 1825. And I included a bust of Lafayette that's actually found in the old house at Peacefield. We might come back and talk about that a little bit later on. So if everybody can just remember that for a quick moment, and we'll come back to it later. Again, thank you so much for having me tonight.
Great. So here's just a view of the Quincy house. Nora, do you want to give like just a little
Sure.
background?
Yeah. So this is the house that was built in 1770 by Colonel Josiah Quincy, who would be the first of 5 Josiah Quincy's. The mayor of Boston at the time Lafayette visited was his grandson. So this was really a summer estate intended to be an escape from the heat of the city. The Quincy men were all, civil servants, deeply engaged in that. But this was a place where several generations at once could kind of come away and get the breeze from the water, which the house is very near to. And in August of 1824, the family was in Quincy when they got ready to welcome Lafayette. So they sort of came into the city to do that. These 2 portraits, Carla, I don't know if you want me to say something about them or if you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you can say who these are the folks in 1824.
Yeah, so in 1824, we have the 3rd Josiah Quincy, who was at that time the mayor of Boston. He was mayor from 1823 to 1828. And he was really a progressive, sort of transformational mayor of Boston at that time, responsible for overhauling a great deal of the city's municipal structure. Things like poverty laws, incarceration, sanitation, lighting, fire codes, all these sort of things, as well as initiating the construction of Quincy Market, which actually happened in 1824, right around the time of Lafayette's visit. It would be completed in 1827. Pictured here with his wife. His wife came from an interesting tradition of women's education. Her mother had really advocated for educating girls and boys the same way, which was not kind of the common thing to do at that time. And that was passed through the generations. So this couple had 3 daughters who actually became kind of the family historians, documenting and preserving the Quincy family history, as well as really accomplished in other areas, one of which was painting. This is a view that Eliza Susan Quincy, their daughter, created of the house. She painted, she also wrote. There are biographies that she was sort of had a hand in that we didn't realize until later, because as a woman, she didn't always get credit for all of her work. She also was an accomplished diarist. She kept exhaustive diaries about her life and her experience with the family. And so during the 1824 visit, she kept a diary that is incredibly detailed about her experience through that week in August of 1824 when Lafayette was in Boston, and the sort of events the family participated in that were centered around him. I don't know if we're gonna kind of save that for a minute, but they had a huge week. Boston really turned out to welcome Lafayette, and her account of it is good reading.
And this is just a little page from one of those diaries with a souvenir that she collected. And this couch we will come back to in a little bit. But do we want to just give a little rundown of some of the events that were part of the Lafayette visit to Boston? You know, he actually came twice, so he came in 1824 and 1825.
So I'll cover the 1824 week here, which began at the end of August. And like I said, the Quincy's were at their house in Quincy at that point. They were outside of the city, but of course, when they knew that Lafayette was coming into Boston, they went right into their house at Hamilton Place. Eliza, the writer of this diary, who was sort of the ringleader of three preservationist sisters, she actually went for that week to stay nearby at the home of the Ticknors. George Ticknor was kind of a noted Boston academic who was close with the family, and Eliza went to his house that week to kind of help out. But they were all bouncing back and forth because the schedule was so intense. The 24th was when Lafayette entered Boston, and there was just a huge military parade on the Common, which Eliza describes in her diary. Sort of the exercises on the Common, the scale of them is just mind-boggling, especially for the time that there were just thousands who turned out in this big space in the center of the city. There were, military exercises on horseback. There were hundreds marching. Apparently, there was a 101 gun salute when he entered the city, and every bell in the city began ringing. They toured the city to see the decorations, which were sort of floral arches and flags everywhere. And there was a poem she recorded that I think really captures the spirit of that moment that was inscribed on some of these decorations. It said, "We bow not the neck, we bow not the knee, but our hearts, Lafayette, we surrender to thee." So you really get this feeling, I think, that Elizabeth described as well, that, Lafayette had everyone at hello. Boston was just so ready to welcome him with open arms. And there were speeches that were given for the whole week. Everybody was just so enthusiastic. The family attended commencement exercises and Phi Beta Kappa exercises at Harvard. There was an amazing speech by Edward Everett, who was the president of Harvard at that time, but also probably the most sought after orator in New England. And he gave a speech that just apparently reduced the whole room to tears. Everyone couldn't get over it. And I read it, and it really is a wonderful tribute to Lafayette. Of course, he went with Mayor Quincy to Charlestown and Bunker Hill. There was a lot of touring Boston, just looking at the exercises and the decorations. There were huge dinners every night. I think it's astounding that anyone could get through a schedule of that intensity. Lafayette was just celebrated so much, it is almost exhausting. And then towards the end of his visit, he actually went out to Quincy and called on the family at their summer house at the Quincy house, which wasn't a long visit, but he was able to sort of shake everyone's hand and say hello to the family, which they very much appreciated after seeing him kind of peripherally at a lot of these events and parties that were given by Boston society for him while he was there. And then he himself threw a ball on his last day on the 30th, just before leaving for the rest of his tour, leaving Boston. So that's kind of the very quick run through his activities that week, but it sounds like an incredible and also incredibly intense week of celebrations.
Yeah, and I mean, and he stopped to see the Quincy family in Quincy right before going to the Adams house for dinner,
Yes.
of course, which was a major part of the visit. And then, he continues on his way on his tour and comes back in June 1825 to Boston because of that Bunker Hill anniversary and the dedication of the memorial that's being built there. And, as he's coming back, he sort of doesn't even like stop at his hotel or his house. He comes directly to the Quincy family, and they're so honored, to receive him like fresh from the road. He just wanted to see them so much, which is how Eliza Susan describes it, and she talks about how he somehow looks younger and healthier even after a year of traveling, or 6 or so months of traveling, which is kind of incredible because clearly Lafayette is an extrovert. He's like enjoying all this attention and like, getting energy from that, because I cannot even imagine like the constant falls and all these things. But he's also like, well, every place we go, there's a carriage, there's a horse, there's a boat, everything's ready for us. It's no trouble to travel anywhere we go. Everything's ready. So like, these stops are all very well orchestrated and arranged, and like the scale of it, and also just the logistics of all of this stuff in a time when communication is slow and difficult, travel is difficult. But she's describing how a rider on horseback like bounds up at 3 a.m. to tell them that he's on his way, and then the mayor runs out to the newspapers to let them know so that everybody will know in the morning when they wake up that Lafayette is arriving today. So like they are really going for it. Like they are pulling out all the stops to make sure this all goes off without a hitch, which is really interesting. And she describes in detail this Bunker Hill dedication. Again, he's being the last living general. There's a few veterans that are still left from the Bunker Hill battle that are also at this ceremony, and he is sitting with them, very chummily, like part of the soldiers, in the audience of this presentation. And it's a huge thing with just tens of thousands of people out on the hill to watch them lay this cornerstone and hear the speech from Daniel Webster. And this is, again, just a kind of event that he felt that he had to be there for. So he made his way back up to Boston and like does this second round because of that. And they throw lots of parties all through the week, and then he kind of finishes out with a night at the theater. And he comes in late for some reason, and they stop the show. Everyone gets up and applauds him. It's a whole thing, and they have to be like, okay, thank you, like let's let the play continue. So it's and there were like several other points where they would stop and like applaud him maybe every time he got up or something. But the excitement just did not abate. And as Elizabeth was saying, like all along the road, so as he is being escorted to New Hampshire, like they escorted him to the border, and like every town they passed through, there's crowds of people that come out. They're literally handing him babies to kiss. I mean, it was like just a scene that it's hard to even imagine. So that was kind of our Boston claim to Lafayette, I feel like, was pretty strong. He kept saying how much, and maybe he said this to all the towns, you never know, but he kept saying how much he loved Boston, how important Boston was to him. And he remembered Josiah Quincy's grandfather, the colonel who was part of the war communications at the time, and he remembered like visiting him there. So I feel like it was something that was kind of an important area to him. And I will stop sharing this just so you see us a little bit more. But I think we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the types of souvenirs and mementos that Elizabeth was showing as well, because just the idea of like, how did people record this moment? How did they preserve this legacy? We know there are, in Historic New England's collection, there are a number of these ceramics, celebratory ceramics, the ribbons with the pictures on them. We have a number of things like that, and then these diaries and records. They clearly were really they knew it was a special moment. They wanted to make sure they remembered every detail. I mean, Eliza Susan Quincy's diaries of these like 2 weeks, it was some 150 pages at least. I mean, it was intense, so detailed. So I think also with the Adams, there are also lots of things that are recorded, right, Hillary?
Oh, it's interesting in talking about Eliza Susan Quincy and all of these pages and pages that she wrote and all of these amazing observations about this visit and the events in Boston. We do have record on the Adams side of all of this from many of these same events. So Charles Francis Adams is writing in his diary about all of this. Charles Francis is the son of John Quincy Adams. So he is John Adams's grandson. And at this point, he's a student at Harvard. And it's a very different perspective than what Eliza Susan is describing. Charles Francis is writing as somebody who is experiencing all of this. You can tell that he understands the significance of it. He knows that Lafayette's to be respected. It's really making an impression on him. But at the same time, he's noting things like that oration by Everett and how he pretty much gave up on it because he didn't get a good seat, and that they should have saved some seats for some of the members of these literary societies, and how he was going to go to all of this great fanfare in Boston and perhaps decided not to, and that Cambridge was rather deserted as everybody went over to Boston for the Lafayette activities. And I mean, he does talk about just the immensity of the planning and the crowds and all of the activities that were planned. And then we see that he's actually being called home to Quincy to be at his grandfather's for Lafayette's arrival there. And that's August 29th, 1824 is the first time that Lafayette visits John Adams. And it's an interesting perspective because once again, we're seeing it from Charles Francis's perspective, where he's noting that the house is in such a bustle that morning as everybody's getting ready for the visit of Lafayette. And it seems that he doesn't get any breakfast that day. So that's something that he's noting along, in his diary alongside of all of this, this list of who came to dinner that night. And it does appear that the Quincy's, or at least, Josiah Quincy, came to John Adams's house for that dinner as well with Lafayette. So everybody's coming out for this. The governor's there, and We have Charles Francis Adams, who is just coming at it from a different perspective at this time, but he understands the magnitude of this occasion. He notes, and I think we see this a little bit on the Lafayette side of things too, with some of the writings from his party, that this greeting between John Adams and Lafayette, they're almost both sort of taken aback by how much time has passed since they had last seen each other, and just the difference, that decades make when you've gone a long time without seeing each other. So, and there was a lot to catch up on, and a really important moment. But yes, it's one of those occasions where we're seeing it from Charles Francis's perspective, who is really in the middle of it and experiencing it in a very different way than perhaps somebody like his father, John Quincy Adams, may have written about it during the time. Now, John Quincy Adams was not present for this. Sounds like they thought that maybe he would make it in for at least the August visit, and it didn't quite work out that way either. And Lafayette and John Quincy Adams do spend time together elsewhere, especially in Washington, D.C., because by the time we get to that last part of Lafayette's visit, John Quincy Adams is in the White House at that point. So that's something that happens in the course of this whole tour. I mean, it's 13 months. There's a lot that changes in the U.S. during this period, that's for sure. But yeah, it's one of the really interesting, accounts of Lafayette's visit. And I think that really pairing it with Eliza Susan Quincy's is just this really fascinating look at just the different ways people are experiencing this event, but understanding its significance and importance. Now, I'm not aware of any Lafayette souvenirs in our collection at the park. I did mention that bust, which isn't quite a souvenir, but we do think that John Adams had that bust of Lafayette in his home at the time of Lafayette's visit in 1824 and 1825. We don't know exactly for sure where it was on display at the time. Today it's on the second floor of the old house at Peacefield outside of John Adams's study. So it's possible, though, that Lafayette, it's just another occasion where Lafayette would look around and there would be his face greeting him. And we do hear some of those stories as well. And if we are going to talk about souvenirs, I did put on my reproduction Lafayette gloves for this for this occasion as well. They did do some, there's some organization, and again, this is not an endorsement, but somebody did do reproduction gloves with Lafayette's likeness right on the hand there. So it must have been interesting, for Lafayette to just see his face everywhere.
There was an account in Philadelphia where a young woman had on her Lafayette gloves with Lafayette's face on them, and she offered her hand for him to kiss, and he said that, like, Mademoiselle, I will not kiss my own face. So I think he was very aware that his face was everywhere, and had a good sense of humor about it seems.
I think you have to, right? You have to have a little bit of a sense of humor. I'm sure you talked about him being like an extrovert and kind of, I mean, he's living it up a little bit. So it's also something where I'm sure he was a little bit pleased.
He really seems to have had, from the things I've read, a real gift for connecting with people individually and sort of making everyone he met feel like they were his friend. And I read more than one account of these sort of parties, which were given sort of by a prominent family, in a high society way, but there would be some portion where just kind of the general public would be maybe allowed through or allowed in a different area. And it seems that he really made a distinct effort to, individually let everyone know how much he appreciated them being there, especially, people who were older or people who were maybe not dressed for the party the same way. He really seemed like he wanted to reach out and make sure all those people knew they were included in this great love he had, for the country. And that certainly, I think, that emotional connection had a big effect on the Quincy's. I think the scene in your book, in George Washington's tomb, which is so kind of emotionally arresting, and also when he visits Washington's tent at Yorktown, and you see how much Washington meant to him and meant to the whole family. There's a great quote at the end of the last kind of letter that Mayor Quincy writes to Lafayette as he's leaving Boston, which says, I met you prepared to admire and to honor one of the fathers of my country. I left you with the feelings which a son cherishes when he separates from a beloved father. So I thought that was really lovely how that kind of, that idea of a almost paternal connection that traveled from Washington to Lafayette then seems to also travel from Lafayette to the Quincy family, who have such personal feelings about him by the time he leaves. I don't know if that kind of rings true to you, Elizabeth, in terms
Yes,
of how he
absolutely.
interacted with people in other places. But in Boston, it seems very much like it was a close personal relationship with Boston.
Yeah, he really had this, which I think is really refreshing about him, because you read so many of these letters from his peers and they come across as like very stuffy and very kind of like you can't really understand the emotion of someone like Jefferson or Washington, where Lafayette doesn't have that same, I guess, I don't know if he necessarily cares about showing his true feelings in writings or in his public kind of persona or what, but he's so gregarious and he's so like emotional that you don't see this from men really in this time period, especially men of Lafayette's kind of like social status.
Yeah.
So it's really refreshing to see that in his letters, and then how he connects with all of these people throughout the United States. And he does say like to pretty much every city, like, oh, this is my favorite. Like, but I think he genuinely meant it. Like, I don't think he was just trying to be like, this is the polite thing to say, that everyone's my favorite. But I really think that what each group of people brought to come out to see him really affected him and emotionally had an impact on him, that they all were his favorite in a way. But yeah, he's a very unique figure, and I think his emotion and how he expresses himself is what makes him so special.
That definitely comes through in Eliza Susan Quincy's writing about him. She really believes that she is kind of a significant figure in the moment in Boston, as far as his recognizing her in a crowd. But I think maybe that was sort of his superpower, was that he was able to make people feel that individually. And I just wanted to say as well, Hillary, the Edward Everett speech, I think that seating must have been a big thing, because Eliza, in her account of that day, noted how pleased she was to get a front row seat, and was just so smug about it. Really, she was a pretty strong personality, and it's so interesting to get those two perspectives of someone who's sitting here and sitting there, and how that affected the day for each of them. She was pretty pleased with herself for the seat that she got.
Wouldn't that be funny if they had talked with each other at some point about this too?
I think
So
they did.
I love that. But back with this Lafayette superpower of connecting with individuals, it's just really impressive the way that he didn't do that necessarily based off of race or gender or socioeconomic class. He connected with so many different people. And for something like this, he could have kept it to where it was behind closed doors, that where it was just very select groups of people, like where he was visiting them in their homes. But even at Peacefield, when he's visiting the Adamses, they have this intimate dinner, but then they throw open the doors and they welcome the public in. And Lafayette's greeting the people of Quincy, and Charles Francis notes that he saluted the ladies of Quincy as well. So, I mean, really taking that moment to, I mean, every step of the way to acknowledge that the public and really make those connections, it's really striking, for somebody to do that.
Yeah, I that's something that really stands out to me with him, and it's just the fact that he's constantly thinking about this. Like, you would think like, oh man, he's doing this 13 months straight, he's gonna slip up on a day, and I'm sure he did have days where he wasn't feeling like so up for it, but the number of stories of him going out of his way to meet with Black veterans of the War of 1812 in New Orleans, or hearing that a group of women were barred from a breakfast event on the basis of their gender, and taking the time to go and meet with them, or hearing that like maybe some people at this one event were excluded because they were not as wealthy as other people, and him insisting, like, he's constantly thinking about this. And like, again, I think that's just genuinely who he was. I think he just was a naturally really good PR person, and like was just thinking about these things, and he wasn't doing it to be like, this is the right thing to do. That's just genuinely who he was. And considering his background of like going to court at Versailles and having this immensely wealthy and like top of the top, like the family he married into, the Noailles family, he could not have married up any higher unless he married into the French royal family. Like he was the top of French society. For him to take the time to think about everybody is really remarkable. I think in the 21st century, as well as it was in the early 19th century, which is it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think that was also reciprocated by people, it seems. We read several accounts of days when Lafayette was maybe a little bit at the end, and the crowds, recognizing that, took care to not sort of disturb him and not be too unruly and too overwrought around him. So yeah, it seems like there's this nice like reciprocal understanding and appreciation of what Lafayette is doing and of what the people he's coming out to see are doing in return, and that they all are just, there is so much good feeling about what's happening. There was a quote that said something like, you know, despite the excitement of the day, the crowd gave not a single huzzah, which Carla and I were saying probably took some effort because they were pretty excited. Anytime he was in the vicinity, all people wanted to do was huzzah. So to not huzzah out of consideration to Lafayette must have meant they were also really thinking about him as a person with needs, as opposed to, you know, kind of like a doll who was being paraded around. They were there for Lafayette as well.
And I think what's really incredible about this, and I really have to thank you again, Elizabeth, for putting this all into context for us too, about what Monroe is hoping to accomplish with a visit like this, and this moment that we have in history, this era of good feelings, but the extent of that, you know, that is, you know, the extent that that's true. I mean, the election of 1824 happens when Lafayette's here, and it's very contested, and it's the corrupt bargain that, as it's called, that puts John Quincy Adams in the White House. So I just so appreciate. I just wanted to thank you for that context there, and it's just, it makes it all more incredible that this unfolded the way that it did.
Well, absolutely. My pleasure. I think that's my favorite part about these like major historic events is like they don't happen in a vacuum. There's all these other things happening around it. And I think that's what makes these stories more remarkable and memorable, and especially when it comes to Lafayette's visit in 1824. It was a thing like before I was doing the research on this, like I knew about it. I talked about Lafayette's tour when I worked at the Capitol building, but I didn't understand like the true impact of it until I took the time to like dig into it for this book. And so yeah, I'm glad to have the opportunity to share it with all of you.
I think we're going to take a few questions now. Does that sound okay? So what a couple of people asked basically, how funded this? Like, did he make any money from souvenirs being sold, or like who's putting this together to make it happen?
Money question, great question. So he paid for his own way to come to America. Monroe offered to send him a ship. Lafayette said no. He said that wouldn't look good. So he booked his own passage on a ship and came to America. In terms of funding, it seems like each of these individual kind of events were like funded by the cities or municipalities that like they were happening in. I've read a lot of kind of these like city ledger books of like what was owed, how much did each of these like massive Lafayette dinners cost, like, and some of them had tickets, some of them did not. So there, it seems similar to like how kind of these events are being celebrated for the bicentennial these days. In terms of money that he made, he did not make any money off of souvenirs, but in December of 1824, he addressed Congress. He was the first foreign dignitary to address Congress, and Congress actually awarded him $200,000, which was essentially a repayment of what Lafayette had spent during the Revolution, with no interest though, just kind of what he had spent. And then they also offered him a land grant near present-day Tallahassee, Florida. Lafayette does not move to Florida. He eventually sells off that land. So in an indirect way, he kind of did make money off of it, though that was mostly through the gift from Congress.
a lot of people were asking about his family, his wife, like who was with him. Can you just briefly say kind of who was in his party traveling?
Yeah, so he was traveling with his personal secretary. His name is Auguste Levasseur. Levasseur actually also wrote journals with his travels with Lafayette, with the hopes of like sending that back to France and kind of getting France a little bit more excited about Lafayette. So you can read those. They've been translated into English. You can read them online for free if you would like to follow Lafayette through the eyes of his secretary. He also came with his son, George Washington Lafayette, and George actually had lived with the Washington family when Lafayette was imprisoned. His mother sent George to live with the Washingtons to protect him during the Revolution. Unfortunately, though, Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, she died at the end of 1807, so she did not travel with him. He also had two daughters, Anastasie and Virginie, and they were back home in France with their families. So it was a party of three that was kind of traveling, the core group that was traveling together in Lafayette's party. And then there was like some other people that kind of would come along with him, but those are like his kind of family group was him, his secretary, and his son.
Um, do we know if Lafayette and Adams saw each other in 1825? I think I remember that they did.
They did.
Did was there any difference in in the second visit?
From what I can tell, I think we have even less documentation of the second visit of Lafayette. It's sort of that it's just noted that he made a return visit before perhaps going to, I think he dined elsewhere. Actually spent the evening following it at the Lloyd residence. And so he's making a quick stop again, but unfortunately, I don't know much of anything about what they might have talked about during that visit, who all accompanied them, how much time they spent together. But Lafayette definitely came back. A couple of different dates. I think there's one account that puts by a General William Barton. I think that's who that might have been. But there's a journal that puts it at June 18th, 1825. And then I think Lavasseur says June 20th, something like that. So it's after the Bunker Hill anniversary, though, as he's still there in Boston for a few days following that. So yeah, not quite sure what they talked about that second time, but there was a second visit.
I know that just from Eliza's diary that Josiah Quincy takes Lafayette out to see Adams in Quincy. But it seems like, yeah, it was kind of a short visit and the family doesn't go with him. So, you know, she records every detail of everything, but she wasn't there. So just have the like he went there part of it. What another think our the last question that was kind of an interesting one is although he was no longer living during the Civil War, were Lafayette's words or writing used in support of emancipating enslaved people at
Yes.
that time?
Absolutely. Most notably, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts invokes Lafayette's words. Also, Frederick Douglass referenced Lafayette. There is a massive broadside about 10 years after Lafayette's death. An English abolitionist quoted Lafayette as saying, like, had I known I was going to like form a land of slavery, I would have never raised my sword in defense of America. He's saying that Lafayette said this. It's not, it may be not necessarily what Lafayette said. It seems like not completely in line with like kind of his tone, but it could have been like maybe a paraphrase thing. But that was turned into massive broadsides to support the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War. So although he was no longer alive, his messaging, his anti-slavery movement was absolutely being used in antebellum into Civil War America.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This was like a really great conversation, a way to kick off sort of our celebrations locally. You know, with Historic New England, we are opening the Quincy House starting June 7th. We'll be open through October on Saturdays for tours. So come and hear more about this story and other stories there. And we're having our sort of Lafayette celebration event on June 15th. So from 5 to 7, it's called An Evening with Lafayette, and Lafayette himself will be stopping by and greeted by the mayor and Eliza Susan, his wife, and we'll have some fun activities. The house will be open to visit, so that will be a nice way to like feel a little taste of what it was like at that time. And Hillary and folks from the Adams site will also be there helping us with that. And I flashed on the screen for a little while that beautiful settee, which is a Grecian couch designed by Isaac Vose and Son, which is currently at the Historic New England's Otis House in Boston. And I put that up there because when Lafayette was here in Boston the first time in 1824, they put him up in this like kind of gentleman's club sort of house, but they like completely fitted it out for his visit. And Vose and Son was a furniture maker in Boston that designed most of the furnishings, and other designers and decorators were contributing things to this house to make this beautifully furnished house. And they describe like all the president's portraits being on the wall in one of the reception rooms and things. And then almost immediately after, like 2 weeks after he left, they had an auction and auctioned off all the contents of this house. So you could have the couch that Lafayette sat on. So that takes like souvenirs to another level. They had, so the piano he played on, every mirror he looked in, it was all up for sale to like fund the creation of this space for him. And it was the fact that it belonged to Lafayette was documented by the family that purchased it. Recorded couch from Lafayette's visit, like in the records when the estate went up for sale. So that couch was kept and then donated to Historic New England in the 1920s. And then that story actually got lost at that point or around then. And they found out, they like somehow matched it up to the records and realized, again, that is the Lafayette couch. So that is at Otis House if you want to see it in person. And we hope you'll visit some other things. I think Mariah is gonna tell you about even more things, and thank you again.
Yes, thank you all so much. And thank you, Elizabeth, Hillary, Nora, Carla, for such a fabulous, fabulous program for us this evening. And thank you all for choosing to spend your time with us. Please join us for our next virtual program. First, a special new program, Pierce House Climate Action Planning, which will be on May 21st. And then our final virtual program, for the season, Spinsters and Confirmed Bachelors LGBTQ+ at the Codman Estate, which will be on June 3rd. We have several exciting in-person programs coming up, including 100 Years and 4 Objects, a quick tour of Otis House on Friday, May 16th, Bauhaus Birthday Party at Gropius House on Saturday, May 17th, and as Carla mentioned, if you want more Lafayette, join us at Quincy House on June 15th for an evening with Lafayette. You can register for these virtual and in-person programs, see what else is on our calendar, or continue to support our work by becoming a member of Historic New England on our website, www.historicnewengland.org. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening.